Okay. This is Paula from Plantland again, and this is going to be one of our short classes. We're going to talk about growing onions, because onions are one of the things that we actually can be putting in the ground either now or pretty close to now. And Plantland has all of their onions and onion sets available for sale now. So onions can go in the ground when the ground is still fairly cool. If you read the back of a package of green onions, for example, you'll see that it says that you can sow them outside 4 to 6 weeks before your last average frost date, which basically here means that you can sow them outside somewhere in the beginning of April. If you listened to any of our garden seminars earlier, you would have heard us talk about soil thermometers. This is a thermometer that we sell here at Plantland that you would use to test the temperature of your soil. Now down on where I live, down on Flathead Lake, my soil in my raised beds is getting plenty warm enough for me to do something like plant onions. It's up in the 45 to 50 degree range. If you've got still snow on the ground, or if your ground froze pretty hard this winter, in those parts of the valley, you're probably not ready to do something like plant onions yet. When we talk about planting onions, it's a little bit of there's a lot of different kinds. It's a little bit of a confusing thing. Onions that we buy in the store, there are basically, I'm going to go over 4 different kinds here. So there's your basic yellow onion, which we think of as a really good keeper. This is the onion that if you're frying up some sloppy joes or something, you might cut up this kind of onion and put it in that. This is the kind of onion you would use in stews or something, soups. So this we usually think of as a fairly good keeper, a yellow onion. Then there's white onions, which we think of as having a little bit different flavor, not a lot, but for some people's palates they can tell. White onions aren't quite as good a keeper as yellow onions, but they still are considered a pretty good keeper. And we use those maybe for soups, and that is how I tend to use white onions. And stocks, I tend to use them in my stocks. Red onions, on the other hand, we don't think of as being great keepers. Red onions are something we would use in salads and things like that, that it's more of a fresh eating rather than a cooked onion. And then this is a sweet onion. This is actually a Texas sweet onion. You know sweet onions by names like Vidalia onions, you know them as Walla Wallas. And that's a good sweet onion that you use for fresh eating, that you slice it up to put it on a hamburger, that you'd slice it up to put it in a salad, things like that. And just as an aside, did you know that flatter onions are much sweeter than rounder onions? So when you're standing in front of the sweet onion bin, you should pick the flattest onions to get the sweetest onions. Now, how do we grow all those different kinds of onions? Well, here's the trick. Oh, and then the last kind, the last kind is scallions, green onions. We know them as spring onions, green onions. Lots of different people use lots of different names for them. These are onions. You do use them some in cooking. You should certainly use them in Asian cooking, and you use them quite often in salads and things like that. This is a good example of something that you can grow very early. Okay, so now how do we grow all these different kinds of onions? Well, you can start all of these from seed. So here we have seeds for red onions and yellow onions, and I'm sure inside we have seeds for Walla Wallas and we have seeds for white onions. These kinds of onions, you need to really plant these seeds pretty early. This is something that you could plant in January inside, and then you'll just pull them apart when you plant them outside to grow them on. So you can actually grow your onions from seed, but it's a project you need to get started early in the season in order to get very good size onions out of your seed starting project. For that reason, we typically grow these 3 kinds of onions, and we'll put the sweet onion down for a minute. The red, the yellow, and the white, we typically grow them from what we call onion sets, which are small onions that we purchase that turn into the big onions. And just so everybody's clear on this, when it's a seedling, when it's one onion plant you've grown from a seed, one plant gives you 1 onion. When it's a onion set start, one little onion set start, this little onion right here will grow up to be this size onion. So you're only going to get 1 onion per start, 1 onion per little seedling. It's important to know that. It's not a plant that flowers or that produces lots more bulbs or anything. So when you're purchasing your seed sets, or you're planting your seeds and getting ready to set the little plants out, you need to be thinking about how you're going to do, how many you're going to get from your seeds. Other kinds of onions that we grow really easily here are things like leeks are actually an onion, and shallots are actually an onion. Leeks are something that we'll sell starts of later, and you once again, this is bunching onions, so this is this kind of onion that we're selling in a start form. These, where you could plant seeds for these right now in your garden, putting these kind of onions out, you do want to wait until it gets just a little bit warmer, and you do want to harden off these plants that are coming out of the greenhouse. So that by hardening off, we mean you're putting them out during the nice warm days like today, putting them inside at night, putting them out during the day, and you're doing that for about a week so that these get accustomed to being outdoors as opposed to being in the greenhouse. So a container like this, you're just going to tease apart, and I'll just make a mess. Tease apart the roots a little bit, and plant each individual plant. This plant, spring green onion, is going to grow into a bigger version of this. These are actually very, very easy to grow from seed, and you can plant easier. So planting them from starts like this, it's okay if you don't have room to start a bunch of seedlings. It's okay to get some from starts, but they're so easy to grow in the ground from seed that you should at least consider that. These are the Walla Walla starts, and later we'll have Walla Walla starts that are actually bundles of plants. Or do we have some? Michelle's going to go get me some. I missed them, must be. So this is the same idea. I'm not going to wreck this little 6-pack. Let's pretend this is my Walla Wallas. It's the same idea. You're going to take it and you're going to tease apart these roots so that you have individual plants. Remember, the Walla Walla is your sweet onion. We don't sell starts for Walla Wallas that look like this. And the reason for that is this is not any kind of keeping onion, including keeping down to seed form. So they get started from seed in containers like this and grow on to something like this. So these little seedlings, one of these that you buy like this in a bundle, and I think there's 50 in a bundle, or one that you start from seed yourself that comes like this, this one plant is going to produce one of these, one onion. The next thing you need to know about growing onions is about soil and fertilizer. Whenever you're growing any kind of root vegetable that the bulb has to grow bigger, has to push out into the soil, you want it growing out into the loosest possible soil. And so you want your garden soil where you're growing this to be very loose and very friable, very good tilth, very good texture. For onions, you usually want a good depth of about 12 inches of good soil. It's a good thing to grow in a part of the garden where you don't necessarily have great soil, but you can improve 12 inches of soil. If you want to grow them in containers, the sky's kind of the limit. If you just want a little crop of spring onions to grow, bunching onions to grow, you can start some seeds in a container this small. You can thin them out as they grow and eat the thinnings, so that you're just thinning them out so that you get bigger onions towards the end of the season, and you can grow a fairly good sized crop in just this size container. If you want to grow onions, sweet onions, you can grow in this size container. You see we've got some good depth, so you would be planting pretty close to the bottom. You'd only be putting your onion sets about this deep, this onion about this deep or so, 2 inches deep or so, and you'd want a full soil column. But you could grow in this size container a fairly nice little crop of onions. I grow leeks. I grow leeks in a container that's a little bit bigger than this, not very much bigger than this, and I buy them in this form from here at Plantland, tease them out, and plant each individual leek. And because I'm only trying to get them to grow to a diameter about like this, I can plant them fairly close in a fairly small container and get a really nice little crop of leeks that I then dry to have for soups and things later in the season. If you're just doing containers, sky's the limit as far as the big container you want to do. The only thing you want to be careful is Earlier we talked about putting a full soil column in a container like this. Shallower would be better for onions. So if you had a container that was a little shallower, only by about 6 inches or so, that would be better for onions. As far as water and fertilizer go, because you're growing a root, the fertilizers that have the higher middle number, the higher phosphorus number, are ideal for something like onions. So this fertilizer is what you would want to use on your onion crop. So if you're growing them in containers in good potting soil with compost mixed in at 50-50, and then add fertilizer according to the directions on the back of the package. Typically that's going to be early in the season and then a couple more times over the growing season. Put the fertilizer on. You're going to get a nice little crop of onions that way. The last thing to know about onions is when to harvest them. Typically it's pretty late in the season, so we're talking into late August, early September. The tops will start to knock down. The tops will start to die down. They don't look unhealthy or anything, but they just start to push down. That's when it's getting close to time, or that's when it is time to pull your onions. You should dig your onions up. You're digging this up. And remember, we're not talking these kind of onions. We're talking your crops that you're going to keep maybe. Dig your onions up. You leave the tops on to cure them. Usually what I do is dig them up and just lay them over for a few days on the soil, right where they're sitting, unless it's going to rain. I don't do that if it's going to rain. And then there's a few days later, I'll bring those into the garage, or actually the carport, where I cut the tops off and then I put them onto screens where they cure, they dry for the winter, and they will keep good like that. You can, over the course of the growing season, of course, pull out smaller onions to use anytime you want to use an onion that's fresh grown from your garden. These kinds of onions you're going to be using up over the course of the summer. They're not going to overwinter, and you're going to just keep using those and grow as they grow. Sweet onions you're going to either harvest all at one time, and these usually come in a little earlier in the season than these do, or you can harvest some small ones early in the season to have some good sweet onions you grew yourself. But then these sweet onions you're going to want to use fairly quickly. You're not going to want to try to store them. So that's a pretty quick overview of onions. As far as shallots go, there's some different fancy kinds. Shallots are kind of a mild onion flavor, a little bit of a cross between garlic and onions. Again, you're planting seed. You're planting this kind of thing that's going to grow you one shallot for each piece. Shallots are a really good thing that you could grow you could grow this whole bag of shallots in this size container, and shallots are a good example of something that you can mince up and dry or mince up and freeze. I sometimes take shallots and freeze them in olive oil in an ice cube tray, because then I have those nice minced up shallots. It's really good when you're just trying to get dinner on the table. So you can take my recipe, something like for pork chops, where I just throw a couple of those ice cubes in a baking dish, put them in the preheating oven, and as the oven heats, that oil melts. Those shallots are in there. You put the pork chops in with a little other seasoning, and you've got a really quick dinner on the table. So shallots are a good one for preserving. That's a really fast overview of onions. If you have any questions, you can let us know at the email, which is askplantland@gmail.com, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can with your answers about growing plants. This is Paula at Plantland, and happy gardening.